Welcome to ABC, Adult Bible and Catechism, a summer 2020 offering of faith formation by Good Shepherd Lutheran Church. It's a series of weekly presentations that will aid you in your understanding of the Lutheran Christian faith and how it affects the way you see life through the lens of faith in Jesus Christ. Thanks for joining us again this week. Let's begin with this week's presentation.
Well, welcome folks to our early church edition here of the ABCs. And after the Gospels, the disciples were sent out to do some stuff, right? Well, Luke wrote a second story. We could call it Luke 2. It's called Acts of the Apostles. And Luke took the story of it begins with Jesus ascending back to heaven and the disciples kind of looking up and two angels coming and saying, hey, he told you to go back, wait, and you'll receive this Holy Spirit. So it's kind of, I think, the beginning of that. Don't be so heavenly minded that you're of no earthly good. But 10 days later, on the festival of Pentecost, the Holy Spirit, this advocate, the paraclete, whatever name you want to use, was sent to the apostles. And all of a sudden, the story goes that they could speak all these different languages so that they were given the tools to go out and spread the good news about Jesus. And people were gathered there for this festival of Pentecost, and they heard all of these different languages. And Peter does a sermon. And at the end of his sermon, he tells about Jesus and all this stuff. And at the end of the sermon, 3,000 people convert to Christianity. Well, Luke, in his second story, the Acts of the Apostles, or I like to sometimes call it the most excellent adventures of Peter and Paul, because they're kind of the two main characters. Peter represents the old school, the connection to Jesus. He was Jesus' best friend. Jesus gave him the keys to the kingdom. But Peter still is continuing to learn through visions and encounters. He learns about taking this message out to the Gentiles. And as you go through the Acts of the Apostles, the story of the early church and how things spread, you get these little sermons. There's a sermon that Stephen, one of the deacons, the church grew so big and so quickly that all of a sudden the disciples needed some helpers to do the service while they did the preaching. So they selected 7 deacons, and one of these deacons was a man named Stephen. And the early part of Acts is the disciples trying to be more of a reform movement. They wanted to show how Jesus had fulfilled this great promise that Judaism had received. But with the stoning of Stephen, it becomes apparent that they need to break out on their own. And one of my favorites in chapter 5, every time the disciples show up at the temple and preach about Jesus, they get arrested. And that's kind of a theme in Acts. The disciples keep getting thrown into jail, and God miraculously gets them out of jail. And in that process, they convert guards and officials and such. But one day they're brought before the Sanhedrin. And this is about the 3rd time this has happened. And they send out Peter, Paul, and Peter, James, and John, and a wise old Sanhedrin named Gamaliel stands up and he gets this wonderful speech in chapter 5, verses 33 through 39. And he basically says, you know, folks, we've seen this before. There was this group that was going to kick the Romans out. They were overcome. There was this group that was going to do this. There was this group that was going to do that. So I tell you what, if this is of human origin, it's going to fail. It'll just fail on its own. But if this is of God, we can't stop it. So why are we wasting our time? And so they're told one more time, don't preach this Jesus, but they go out and preach Jesus. And after the stoning of Stephen, the church starts to get persecuted in Jerusalem. And so people start going out. One of the other familiar stories is that one of the deacons, Philip, is heading south out of Jerusalem, and he runs into a man, an Ethiopian treasurer, someone from the court of the Queen of Ethiopia, reminding us the Queen of Sheba, back to that group. And Philip is told by a spirit to go and talk to that man. And we have our first encounter with evangelism. They share their story. He gets to share about Jesus, how Jesus fulfills the story. He baptizes the Ethiopian, and he gets whisked away. And the Ethiopian takes Jesus back to Ethiopia. So we see this every time the church is persecuted, it grows because it starts to spread out. All sorts of stories. You have that, all these little sermons that keep coming up that show the fulfillment. And one of the important stories is that I had mentioned that Stephen, that little sermon he did talking about Jesus. Well, there was a young man there named Saul who heard this sermon. And before Stephen was stoned, everyone kind of went and threw their coat at Saul's feet and said, "Here, would you watch our stuff while we go stone this guy?" And Saul was one of those true believers. And I always imagine that when he heard this Stephen give his witness, it just froze him. Because in his mind, it was like, wait, could this be true? Is this what I've believed? And he becomes zealous for suppressing the message of Jesus. But then Saul goes on a little trip up to Damascus to try to persecute some Christians, and he gets to encounter Jesus. And Jesus says, "Saul, I've got a plan for you. You're going to be my missionary to the Gentiles." And you know him as Paul. He changes his name. And anytime someone's name changes, look out. And he does a 180. All of a sudden, he goes from a persecutor to a proclaimer of the church. And the rest of the book of Acts is this back and forth of Paul heading out with the blessing of the people in Jerusalem, the council, the elders, to go out to the Gentiles. And so we see these stories back and forth of Peter having visions, encountering the Gentiles, Paul going out. He goes all the way out to Europe. And when Pastor Bob tells you about the epistles next week, many of those letters are Paul writing letters to these churches that he begins. And wondering about how do we do this? How do we live this godly life? And that's kind of more of what the epistles will tell you. But our history that we see in Acts is a history of the early church. And ultimately, in the end, Paul goes on three or four missionary journeys around the Mediterranean, up into Europe and such. And that's how we trace where Paul went, is through his journeys. Paul has kind of a pattern he develops. He usually would come into a town, like we're overlooking Bismarck here, and he would find the local synagogue. He'd go to the synagogue. He was a Pharisee. He would start to teach, but he'd teach about Jesus. He'd usually last there a couple weeks, and some people would go, "Oh, I like this guy's message," and other people are like, "Oh no, this isn't the doctrine," and he'd get kicked out. But usually at the door were some local people, the local Gentiles, saying, "Hey, we like your message. Come to our house and keep telling us about Jesus." And Paul would start these small churches, these community churches. And sooner or later, before you know it, Paul would make somebody angry because of what he would say. He'd either get thrown into prison, beaten up, or run out of town on a kind of a rail. But his churches stayed there. And there's always kind of a question in Acts as to whether the Holy Spirit comes with Paul or Peter, or has the Holy Spirit already got there? So when they do baptizing, often the Holy Spirit's already been there. And they say, "Oh, we got to get these people baptized because the Spirit is here." So that's one of those great questions. And there's one other great story that I have of Paul that kind of gives you an idea of Paul. He goes to Athens. Athens is the intellectual, philosophical Greek center. And as he's walking around town, he notices all these altars to all these different gods. And then he finds an altar to an unknown God. And Paul is very good at what we would call probably today cultural adaptation. So he looked at that altar and he said to the philosophers there. Now these are the philosophers of Plato and Socrates and Aristotle. This is the thought that Alexander had brought to the whole world. This is the way people did philosophy 400 years after these philosophers. And Paul gathers the wise men and he says, I see you are very religious. You have an altar here to an unknown God. Let me tell you, I know that unknown God. And he is able to talk about Jesus. Paul ultimately at the end of his letter is arrested because he's in the temple talking about Jesus. They want to beat him up. He gets arrested by the Romans and he ends up going all the way back to Rome. And the book kind of ends with Paul on this journey to Rome. We think he was martyred, but maybe not. And he went out and did more ministry. He supposedly was on his way to Spain. But this story is our story. It's about how we grow as churches, how we are the church, and how we are to share God's love and message with the world. So we have the examples of Peter and Paul to help us on that way. Well, if you read Acts, I hope you have some fun, enjoy those little sermons and all their misadventures, and this will help you when you start to look at Paul's letters and the general letters that help us to understand how we are to live a godly life and what Jesus means for us. Thanks for joining me today, and we look forward to seeing you in the future for ABC.